The fastest way to discover a person's character is to see how they react when money cannot buy what they want. On a cold autumn evening in downtown Chicago, Sarah Mitchell moved gracefully between tables inside Sterling House, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. At 50 years old, she had spent nearly 3 decades working in hospitality. She had served celebrities, politicians, athletes, and business leaders. Yet despite all those years, she still believed the most important part of her job was treating every guest with dignity. The restaurant buzzed with energy as conversations blended with soft piano music. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished wood floors while waiters carried trays filled with expensive meals. Near the center of the dining room sat Richard Sterling, a billionaire entrepreneur whose name appeared regularly in business magazines and financial news. People often changed their behavior around him. Some wanted his approval. Others hoped to impress him. Many simply recognized the power that came with his wealth. That evening Richard occupied the restaurant's most exclusive table while entertaining several influential business associates. Sarah had been assigned to serve them. Throughout the meal she remained professional, attentive, and calm. She answered questions, anticipated requests, and ensured every detail met the restaurant's high standards. Several members of Richard's party complimented her service. Sarah thanked them politely and continued working. As the evening progressed, Richard paid closer attention to her. Unlike many employees who seemed intimidated by his reputation, Sarah treated him exactly the same way she treated everyone else. She was respectful but not impressed. Professional but not eager to please. The difference intrigued him. After nearly 2 hours, the dinner finally ended. Laughter filled the table as contracts were discussed and future plans were celebrated. Richard appeared satisfied with the evening. When Sarah delivered the final receipt folder, he signed the bill and slipped something extra inside before sliding it toward her. Sarah thanked the group and carried the folder toward a service station. When she opened it, her eyes widened slightly. Inside was an envelope. She carefully removed the contents and discovered $5,000 in cash. Several nearby employees gasped when they noticed the amount. For many people, it represented several weeks of income. Sarah remained quiet. She looked at the money for several seconds before carefully placing it back into the envelope. Then she walked across the dining room toward Richard's table. The businessmen were preparing to leave when she arrived. Richard noticed the envelope in her hands and smiled confidently. He appeared to expect gratitude. Instead, Sarah gently placed the envelope on the table in front of him. The smile faded. "Sir," she said politely, "I appreciate the gesture, but I cannot accept this." The entire table fell silent. One executive looked confused. Another raised his eyebrows. Richard stared at her. "You cannot accept it," he repeated. "That is correct," Sarah replied. "Thank you, but I must respectfully decline." Richard leaned back in his chair. During his life, countless people had accepted gifts, opportunities, favors, and money from him. Very few had ever refused. Was the amount too small? He asked with a slight smile. Sarah shook her head immediately. "No, sir. The amount is not the issue." "Then what is?" Richard asked. Sarah paused briefly. Her expression remained calm. "I simply have a personal reason for not accepting unusually large tips." Richard studied her face. The answer seemed to irritate him more than he expected. Around them, nearby diners and employees sensed the tension beginning to grow. Sarah offered a courteous nod. "Thank you for dining with us tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening." Then she turned and walked away. Behind her, Richard continued staring at the envelope resting untouched on the table. For the first time in years, someone had refused something he believed nobody would ever reject. And that single decision was about to set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could possibly imagine. Richard Sterling remained seated long after Sarah Mitchell walked away from the table. Around him, his business associates exchanged uncertain glances. One of them laughed nervously and tried to lighten the mood. "Well, that is certainly a first." Another executive shook his head. "I do not think I have ever seen anyone refuse $5,000. Richard did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the envelope resting in front of him. Throughout his career, money had solved problems, opened doors, and influenced countless decisions. It had become so common for people to accept whatever he offered that he rarely questioned it anymore. Yet Sarah had returned the money without hesitation. More importantly, she had done so without trying to make a statement or attract attention. That detail bothered him. As the group prepared to leave, Richard slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket and stood. "Interesting woman," one associate commented. Richard forced a slight smile. "Or a foolish one." The word sounded confident, but deep down he was not entirely convinced. Across the restaurant, Sarah continued working as though nothing unusual had happened. She refilled drinks, greeted guests, and carried trays through the crowded dining room with the same calm professionalism she had shown all evening. Several co-workers approached her during brief moments between tables. "Are you serious?" one waitress whispered. "That was $5,000. Another employee shook his head in disbelief. "I would have accepted it before he finished speaking." Sarah smiled politely but offered no explanation. She simply returned to work. The mystery surrounding her decision only grew. Near closing time, Richard unexpectedly returned to the restaurant entrance after realizing he had left an important folder behind. As he crossed the dining room, he noticed Sarah speaking with an elderly couple. The woman appeared emotional. Sarah knelt beside the table and listened patiently while the couple shared something personal. A few moments later the elderly woman smiled through tears and squeezed Sarah's hand. The interaction lasted less than a minute, yet it caught Richard's attention. Sarah was not performing for tips. She was simply being kind. For reasons he could not explain, that observation irritated him even more. The next morning, Richard arrived at the headquarters of Sterling Enterprises. Yet instead of focusing on quarterly reports and investment meetings, he found himself thinking about the waitress. By lunchtime, curiosity had slowly transformed into wounded pride. The more he thought about the situation, the more convinced he became that Sarah's refusal had been directed at him personally. Why else would someone reject such a generous gift? Late that afternoon he called an acquaintance who happened to own part of the restaurant group operating Sterling House. During the conversation, Richard casually mentioned Sarah. "The waitress?" the owner asked. "Yes," Richard replied. "What do you know about her?" The owner laughed softly. "Not much. She has been there for years. Reliable. Respected. Never causes problems." The answer did not satisfy him. That evening, Richard returned to Sterling House unexpectedly. Employees immediately recognized him. Some assumed he had forgotten another item. Others believed he was meeting clients. Instead, he requested a private conversation with the restaurant manager. Minutes later, standing near the office overlooking the dining room, Richard pointed toward Sarah as she served guests below. "I want to know why she refused the tip." The manager looked surprised. "Sir, I do not think that is any of our business." Richard's expression hardened. "It became my business the moment she rejected it." Down below, completely unaware of the conversation taking place above her, Sarah continued working through the dinner rush. She had no idea that a decision she considered deeply personal had become an obsession for one of the wealthiest men in Chicago. And before the week was over, that obsession would place both of their lives on a collision course neither of them expected. The following evening, the atmosphere inside Sterling House felt different, although most customers could not have explained why. Employees sensed a tension that seemed to hang quietly over the restaurant. Sarah Mitchell noticed it as well. Several co-workers glanced toward her throughout the evening, then quickly looked away when she caught them watching. She assumed rumors about the refused tip had continued spreading. That did not surprise her. Restaurants were built on conversations, and unusual stories rarely stayed private for long. What she did not know was that Richard Sterling had spent the entire day thinking about her. By 7 o'clock, the restaurant was nearly full. Sarah moved efficiently between tables, greeting guests and ensuring every order was correct. Her focus remained on her work. Then the manager approached her. "Sarah, could you come to the office for a moment?" His tone sounded unusual. Several nearby employees immediately fell silent. Sarah felt a slight knot form in her stomach. She nodded and followed him upstairs. Through the office window she immediately saw Richard standing near the glass overlooking the dining room. The billionaire turned as she entered. The manager quietly closed the door behind her. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Richard studied her expression. Sarah remained calm. "You wanted to see me?" she asked politely. Richard folded his arms. "I have been trying to understand your behavior." Sarah blinked. "My behavior?" "The tip," he replied. "Most people would consider it generous." "It was generous," Sarah answered. "Then why refuse it?" Sarah had expected this question. "I already explained that I have personal reasons." Richard shook his head. "That is not an explanation." The conversation immediately grew uncomfortable. Sarah kept her voice measured. "With respect, sir, I do not believe I owe anyone an explanation for a personal decision." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Throughout his life, very few people had spoken to him that way. Not because Sarah was rude. She was not. The problem was that she refused to be intimidated. "Do you understand how your actions appeared?" Richard asked. "Some people might see them as disrespectful." Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "Disrespectful? You rejected a gift offered in good faith. I thanked you for it. And then returned it. Because accepting it would have violated a promise I made long ago." The moment the words left her mouth, Richard noticed something change in her expression. For the first time, emotion briefly appeared behind her calm exterior. Yet she said nothing more. Richard waited. Sarah remained silent. The unanswered question irritated him. "A promise," he repeated. "That is all you are willing to say?" "Yes," Sarah replied. Richard let out a slow breath. "You know, people spend their lives hoping for opportunities. Yet you seem determined to reject them." Sarah met his gaze. "Money and opportunity are not always the same thing." The answer landed harder than she intended. Richard interpreted it as criticism. "Perhaps you believe you are making some kind of statement." "I am not making any statement," Sarah replied quietly. "I simply made a choice." Downstairs, dinner service continued while employees wondered what was happening behind the closed office door. Several had noticed Richard arrive earlier. Now they watched the office window anxiously. Finally Richard stepped back. "You are free to go." Sarah nodded politely and turned toward the door. Just before she reached it, Richard spoke again. "For someone who works for tips, you seem strangely comfortable turning them down." Sarah paused. For a brief moment, disappointment crossed her face. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just disappointment. Then she opened the door and left. Richard remained alone in the office staring through the glass at the dining room below. He told himself he had every reason to be frustrated. Yet deep down another feeling had begun growing beneath the irritation. Curiosity. Because the more he tried to understand Sarah Mitchell, the less sense she seemed to make. And hidden somewhere behind that mysterious promise was a truth neither of them realized would soon change everything. 2 nights after the uncomfortable conversation in the office, Sarah Mitchell finished her shift shortly after 10 o'clock. The streets of Chicago were quiet as she walked the few blocks to the modest apartment building she had called home for nearly 15 years. The neighborhood was not glamorous, but it was familiar. Sarah greeted the elderly doorman, climbed the stairs, and unlocked her apartment door. The space was small and simple. A bookshelf stood against one wall. Family photographs occupied a narrow wooden table near the window. Everything was neat and carefully maintained. After changing clothes and preparing a cup of tea, Sarah moved toward a small cabinet in the corner of the living room. From the bottom drawer she removed a worn wooden box. The box showed signs of age. Small scratches covered its surface. The brass lock had faded over the years. Sarah carried it to the table and sat quietly for several moments before opening it. Inside were dozens of neatly organized letters tied together with blue ribbon. Beneath them rested several photographs and a leather journal. Sarah gently lifted one of the letters and unfolded it. The paper had yellowed with time. Her eyes moved slowly across the familiar handwriting. A soft smile appeared on her face. The words were not new. She had read them countless times before. Yet they still carried the same meaning they always had. Outside, city lights reflected through the apartment window while Sarah continued reading. Across town, Richard Sterling sat alone inside his penthouse office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Financial reports covered his desk. Several important business decisions awaited his attention. Yet his concentration kept drifting back to the waitress. It frustrated him. He did not understand why. Normally people occupied his thoughts only when they affected his companies or investments. Sarah Mitchell should have been insignificant. Instead, she remained impossible to forget. He replayed every conversation in his mind. The refusal. The calm answers. The mysterious promise. Nothing about the situation made sense. Finally Richard opened his laptop and searched public records. He expected to find something unusual. Perhaps a wealthy family background. Perhaps hidden financial resources. Instead, everything appeared remarkably ordinary. Sarah had worked in hospitality for decades. No scandals. No lawsuits. No unusual wealth. No obvious explanation. The lack of answers only increased his curiosity. The following afternoon, Sterling House prepared for another busy dinner service. Before guests arrived, several employees gathered in the break room. Conversations immediately stopped when Sarah entered. One younger waitress hesitated before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah smiled. "Of course." The woman looked embarrassed. "Why did you really turn down the money?" Others quietly listened. Sarah considered the question. Then she answered gently. "Because some things are worth more than money." The employees exchanged confused looks. One man laughed softly. $5,000 is a lot of money. Sarah nodded. "Yes. It is." "Then why refuse it?" Sarah's expression softened. "Because accepting it would have cost me something more valuable." Nobody fully understood what she meant. Yet something about her answer ended the conversation. Later that evening, after the restaurant opened, Sarah returned to work while Richard unexpectedly arrived once again. This time he did not request a meeting. Instead, he chose a table in the corner and quietly observed. For nearly an hour he watched Sarah interact with guests. He noticed how she remembered regular customers by name. He noticed how she helped new employees without seeking recognition. He noticed how people seemed genuinely happy to see her. The more he watched, the more a strange question formed in his mind. What kind of promise could be important enough for someone to walk away from $5,000 without regret? As dinner service continued, neither Richard nor Sarah realized that the answer had been sitting inside a wooden box for years, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. The following Sunday was Sarah Mitchell's day off. While most people used weekends to rest, she followed a routine she had maintained for years. Shortly after sunrise, she left her apartment carrying a small canvas bag and boarded a city bus heading toward the western side of Chicago. The trip took nearly 40 minutes. When she finally stepped off, she walked several blocks until she reached a modest community center tucked between a church and a public library. The building showed its age, but it remained full of life. Children laughed in the recreation room. Volunteers carried boxes of donated supplies. Families gathered for educational programs and support. Meetings. Sarah entered through a side door and was immediately greeted by several familiar faces. "Good morning, Sarah," one volunteer called. "We were hoping you would be here today." Sarah smiled warmly. "Would not miss it." For the next several hours she helped organize materials, served refreshments, and assisted with a scholarship workshop for local students. Nobody treated her like a hero. Nobody made announcements about her contributions. Most visitors simply assumed she was another volunteer. That was exactly how Sarah preferred it. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Sterling sat in his penthouse reviewing documents when an unexpected conversation changed everything. He had invited the partial owner of Sterling House to lunch. During their discussion, Sarah's name surfaced once again. "You are still thinking about that waitress?" the owner asked with a laugh. Richard frowned slightly. "I am trying to understand her." The owner shook his head. "Then you are looking in the wrong places." Richard leaned forward. "What does that mean?" The owner hesitated. "Several years ago, one of our managers told me she spends most of her free time helping community organizations. I never paid much attention to it. She never talks about herself." The comment immediately captured Richard's interest. Later that afternoon, curiosity led him somewhere he never expected to go. Using information he gathered through public community records, he eventually found the center where Sarah volunteered. He parked across the street and observed from a distance. What he saw surprised him. Sarah was not there for recognition. There were no cameras. No wealthy donors. No publicity. She spent her afternoon helping students complete scholarship applications and encouraging nervous teenagers who doubted themselves. One young girl appeared especially anxious. Sarah sat beside her for nearly 20 minutes offering reassurance. Eventually the student smiled and continued writing. Richard remained inside his car, watching quietly. None of it fit the image he had created in his mind. As the afternoon ended, Sarah prepared to leave. Before she could, the director of the center approached. Carrying a folder. "The new scholarship recipients sent their thank you letters," he said. Sarah smiled. "That is wonderful. You should read them." "You know I never do." The director laughed softly. "That is exactly why you should." After he walked away, Richard continued observing. Scholarship recipients. What scholarships? Confused, he waited until Sarah left before entering the building himself. A brief conversation with the director produced a revelation he never anticipated. For nearly 12 years, Sarah had quietly funded educational scholarships for low-income students using her personal savings. The program carried no public name. Most recipients never knew where the money originated. Richard stared at the director in disbelief. "A waitress pays for scholarships?" The director nodded. "Every year." "Why?" The answer came instantly. "Because someone once helped her when she needed it most." That evening, Richard returned home carrying more questions than answers. Yet one realization had become impossible to ignore. The woman he assumed was rejecting his generosity out of pride had spent years giving away her own resources without seeking recognition. And for the first time, Richard began wondering whether the promise hidden inside that wooden box might be connected to a story far more extraordinary than he ever imagined. That night, Richard Sterling could not sleep. Long after the lights of Chicago faded beyond the windows of his penthouse, he remained seated in his study thinking about everything he had learned. The image of Sarah Mitchell volunteering at the community center stayed with him. More importantly, the discovery that she had quietly funded scholarships for over a decade refused to leave his mind. The woman he had judged as stubborn and unreasonable suddenly appeared very different. Yet one question still remained unanswered. Why had she made that mysterious promise? 2 days later, an unexpected opportunity arrived. During a lunch meeting with the director of the community center, Richard asked if there was anyone who had known Sarah for many years. The director immediately smiled. "You should talk to Margaret Dawson." Later that afternoon, Richard found himself sitting inside a small neighborhood cafe across from a woman in her 70s. Margaret had been a mentor to Sarah since she was a teenager. After a few minutes of conversation, Richard carefully asked about the scholarships. Margaret's expression softened. "Then you do not know the story." Richard shook his head. Margaret looked out the window for a moment before speaking. Sarah's father worked 2 jobs most of his life. They never had much money. When Sarah was 17, she earned admission to a good college but could not afford to attend. Richard listened closely. "What happened?" "A stranger helped her." Margaret smiled faintly. "Someone she never met paid her first year of tuition anonymously." Richard leaned forward. "An anonymous donor?" Margaret nodded. "Sarah spent years trying to discover who it was. She never succeeded." The story immediately captured his attention. Margaret continued. "Her father passed away shortly after that. Before he died, he told her something she never forgot." Richard remained silent. "He told her that if she ever became financially stable, she should help others the same way someone had helped her." Margaret's eyes glistened slightly. Sarah promised him she would. Suddenly everything began fitting together. The scholarships. The volunteer work. The quiet generosity. Yet Richard still sensed there was more. Margaret seemed to notice. A few years after her father died, Sarah created another rule for herself. "What rule?" Richard asked. "She would never personally benefit from unusually large gifts of money." Richard frowned slightly. Margaret nodded. She believed that if she accepted large sums she did not earn, she might slowly lose sight of the promise she made. The words hit Richard harder than he expected. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally he asked, "You mean she refused my money because of a promise to her father?" Margaret smiled. "Not because she disliked you. Not because she wanted attention. Quite the opposite." Richard looked down at his coffee. Suddenly he remembered every assumption he had made. Every conclusion he had reached without understanding the truth. By the time the conversation ended, he felt something unfamiliar. Shame. That evening, after finishing work, Sarah returned home and once again opened the wooden box. She removed a photograph showing herself as a teenager standing beside her father outside a small house. Both were smiling. Behind the photograph rested one particular letter. It contained the final message her father had written shortly before his death. Sarah read it quietly. The words never changed, yet they always brought comfort. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard sat alone in his office staring at the Chicago skyline. For the first time since meeting Sarah, he finally understood why she had returned the envelope. The refusal had never been about him. It had never been about pride. It had been about loyalty to a promise made decades earlier. A promise stronger than money. A promise stronger than social pressure. A promise she had honored every single day of her life. And as Richard stared out at the city lights, he realized something that left him deeply unsettled. The person he had quietly judged as foolish possessed a level of integrity he was no longer certain he himself could match. For the next several days, Richard Sterling found it impossible to return to business as usual. Meetings continued. Contracts were negotiated. Investors called. Yet beneath every conversation lingered the same uncomfortable realization. He had spent weeks judging a woman whose character he barely understood. Worse, he had allowed his pride to transform a simple misunderstanding into something much larger. One Thursday evening, after staring at the untouched envelope still resting inside his desk drawer, Richard finally made a decision. He picked up his phone and called Sterling House. When the hostess answered, he asked a simple question. "Is Sarah Mitchell working tonight?" Less than an hour later, he entered the restaurant. The familiar sounds of dinner service filled the room. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked softly. Servers moved between tables carrying trays of food. Sarah was speaking with a family near the center of the dining room when she noticed him. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Richard could immediately tell she was surprised to see him. Yet she remained professional and continued assisting her customers. He waited patiently until her section became less busy. Finally, Sarah approached his table. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," she said politely. "Welcome back." Richard stood. "May I speak with you when you have a moment?" Sarah hesitated briefly before nodding. "My break starts in 20 minutes. I will wait." Exactly 20 minutes later, they sat across from one another in a quiet corner of the restaurant's outdoor patio overlooking the city lights. The autumn air was cool. Traffic moved steadily in the distance. For several seconds neither spoke. Richard found himself unexpectedly nervous. He had delivered presentations before thousands of people. He had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet this conversation felt far more difficult. Finally he spoke. "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked at him carefully but remained silent. Richard continued. "I made assumptions about you. I convinced myself your decision was about me." Sarah lowered her eyes briefly. "Most people would have assumed the same thing." "No," Richard said quietly. "Most people would have asked questions before reaching conclusions." Sarah studied him. For the first time, she sensed genuine sincerity. Richard took a slow breath. "I know about the scholarships." Surprise flashed across Sarah's face. "You investigated me?" "I did." He nodded honestly. "And I learned things I should have learned before judging you." Sarah leaned back slightly. She did not appear angry. If anything, she seemed tired. "Then you know why I returned the money." "I do now." Richard paused before continuing. "Your father would be proud of you." The words caught her completely off guard. For several moments she said nothing. Then a faint smile appeared. "Thank you." Richard looked out across the city skyline. "You know, I spent most of my life believing generosity was measured by the size of the gift." Sarah listened quietly. "But what you have done all these years is something different." He glanced back at her. "You gave without expecting recognition." Sarah smiled softly. "That was the point." Another silence followed. This one felt far more comfortable than the previous conversations they had shared. Then Richard reached into his jacket and carefully placed the familiar envelope on the table between them. Sarah looked down and immediately recognized it. "Mr. Sterling, do not worry," he interrupted gently. "I am not asking you to take it." She looked surprised. Richard smiled for the first time. "I finally understand that you never will." For the first time since they met, both laughed quietly. It was a small moment, but it changed something important. The conflict that had existed between them began to disappear. Yet neither realized that the most significant turning point in their story was still ahead. Because Richard had not come merely to apologize. He had come with an idea. An idea inspired by everything he had learned about Sarah, her father, and the promise that had quietly shaped her entire life. After their conversation on the patio ended, Richard Sterling drove home with a clarity he had not felt in months. For years he had measured success through growth charts, acquisitions, and financial reports. Yet none of those achievements felt as meaningful as the lesson he had learned from Sarah Mitchell. The following week, he began quietly developing the idea he had mentioned only briefly during their meeting. He assembled a small team of advisors and educational specialists. He reviewed scholarship programs across the country. He spoke with nonprofit leaders and community organizations. Most importantly, he listened. For the first time in a very long time, Richard was not trying to create something that would generate profit. He wanted to create something that would honor a principle. Meanwhile, Sarah continued living exactly as she always had. She worked her shifts at Sterling House. She volunteered at the community center. She reviewed scholarship applications during her evenings. Nothing about her routine changed. In fact, if anything, she seemed slightly uncomfortable with the attention Richard's apology had brought. She preferred helping people quietly. One afternoon, while organizing student applications at the center, she received an unexpected phone call. The director sounded unusually excited. "Sarah, I need you to come by tomorrow morning." "Why?" she asked. "I think you should see this for yourself." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the center shortly after 9 o'clock. Several staff members stood near the entrance smiling. She immediately sensed something unusual was happening. The director escorted her into the main assembly room. As the doors opened, Sarah stopped walking. Nearly 100 students, volunteers, educators, and community leaders filled the room. At the front stood Richard Sterling. For a moment she looked completely confused. Richard stepped forward. "I hope you will forgive the surprise." Sarah glanced around the room. "What is all this?" Richard smiled. "This is the beginning of something important." Behind him hung a large banner displaying the name of a new educational initiative. The program would provide scholarships, mentorship opportunities, tutoring assistance, and financial support for students facing economic hardship. But what caught Sarah's attention was not the program itself. It was the name. The initiative carried her father's name. For several seconds she could not speak. The room grew completely silent. Richard addressed the audience. He explained how one anonymous act of generosity decades earlier had changed a young woman's life. He described how that same woman had spent years paying that kindness forward without seeking recognition. He spoke about integrity. About promises. About character. Yet he never tried to make himself the hero of the story. Instead, he focused entirely on the values Sarah had demonstrated for years. Then he revealed the final detail. The initial funding would support hundreds of students across Chicago. Future expansions would allow the program to reach even more communities. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not because of the money. Not because of the scale of the project. But because someone had finally understood what truly mattered to her. When the applause began, she stood quietly for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. Later, after the event ended and most guests had left, Richard approached her. "I know you cannot accept large gifts for yourself," he said. "So I stopped trying to give one to you." Sarah laughed softly through her tears. "That was probably wise." Richard smiled. "This is not for you." He looked around the room filled with students. "It is for everyone who comes after you." Sarah glanced at the banner bearing her father's name. For the first time since finding that envelope on the restaurant table, she realized the story had never been about refusing money. It had always been about protecting the meaning behind a promise. And now that promise was helping more people than she had ever imagined possible. 6 months later, the scholarship initiative had grown beyond anything Richard Sterling or Sarah Mitchell originally imagined. Applications arrived from every corner of Chicago. Students who once believed college was impossible now had opportunities opening in front of them. Teachers shared stories of renewed confidence. Families spoke about hope replacing uncertainty. What began as a promise passed from a father to his daughter had quietly become a movement touching hundreds of lives. Yet despite the success, Sarah remained exactly the same person. On most evenings she could still be found working at Sterling House, greeting customers with the same warmth she had shown for years. She never asked for recognition. She never spoke about the scholarships unless someone asked directly. To her, the work itself was what mattered. One evening, shortly before closing time, a young woman entered the restaurant carrying a folder. She appeared nervous as she approached Sarah. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" Sarah smiled. "Yes." The young woman opened the folder and removed an acceptance letter from a university. Tears filled her eyes. "I received one of the scholarships." For a moment, neither spoke. Then the student continued. "Nobody in my family has ever gone to college. I just wanted to say thank you." Sarah felt emotion rise in her chest. She congratulated the young woman and wished her success. After the student left, Sarah stood quietly for several seconds. Moments like that reminded her why she had made the promise all those years ago. Across town, Richard sat in his office reviewing the latest program reports. The numbers were impressive. But what mattered most were the letters arriving each week. Stories from students. Messages from parents. Notes from teachers. They all carried the same theme. One opportunity had changed a future. Looking out across the Chicago skyline, Richard thought back to the evening everything began. A restaurant table. An envelope. A refused tip. At the time, he believed money represented generosity. Now he understood something different. True generosity was not measured by what someone gave away. It was measured by why they gave it. A few weeks later, the Scholarship Foundation hosted its first annual gathering. Students, educators, volunteers, and community leaders filled a large auditorium. Richard stood on stage briefly to welcome everyone before stepping aside. The spotlight belonged elsewhere. When Sarah's name was announced, the audience rose to its feet. The applause seemed endless. Sarah looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention, which only made people admire her more. As she approached the podium, she glanced toward a photograph displayed near the stage. It showed her father many years earlier. For a moment, she simply smiled. Then she spoke. She did not talk about sacrifice. She did not talk about success. Instead, she talked about gratitude. She shared how one act of kindness from an anonymous stranger had changed her life. She explained that every opportunity carries responsibility. Most importantly, she reminded everyone that character is revealed not by what a person receives, but by what they choose to do afterward. When the event ended, students gathered around her. Families thanked her. Volunteers shared stories. Yet one conversation stood out above all the others. Richard approached quietly after the crowd began dispersing. "There is something I have wanted to tell you for a long time," he said. Sarah looked at him curiously. Richard smiled. "Thank you for returning the envelope." Sarah laughed softly. "That is not something people usually thank me for." "Maybe not," Richard replied. "But if you had accepted it, I would never have learned the lesson behind it." For a moment, they stood together watching students celebrate their futures. Then Sarah glanced toward the photograph of her father once more. The promise she made years ago had survived every challenge. It had survived hardship, temptation, and misunderstanding. And in the end, it had accomplished exactly what her father hoped it would. It had transformed one act of kindness into hundreds more. Sometimes the most valuable gift is not the money left on a table. Sometimes it is the principle that teaches people what truly matters. And that lesson would continue changing lives long after both Sarah and Richard were gone.